Uh, Thank you so much for joining in. Awesome. I see there are a good amount of folks to actually begin with. Thank you so much for joining the VW webinar, where we always try to upgrade and inspire you with everything around experimentation and conversion rate optimization. I'm your host, Devyansh. I'm a marketing manager at VW, a full funnel website experimentation platform. Today, we have a special guest who I feel a lot of people already know or will know after this presentation. Welcome, Nils from 3Tech.
Hey man, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here today.
Before starting with the actual discussion, I want to let our attendees know that you too can participate in this discussion. GoToWebinar does not allow me to switch on your cameras, but I can switch on your mics. So do share your thoughts on the questions being discussed. Send me a request using the chat or the questions box from the control panel, and I'll be happy to unmute you. Nils, please take it away.
Cool. Give me 1 second because people keep calling me here. So can you all see my screen already? I think so, yeah. All right, cool. So welcome everyone. I'm happy to host this session today on building blocks of a strong experimentation program. So we work with clients ranging from more or less small e-commerce brands to bigger e-commerce brands, but also in other areas. And our goal as an agency is usually not just to be a siloed function where we run experiments and people in the company just get the fruits from them, but really we want to build an experimentation program, basically scale it up so the company can then later use the spirit of experimentation for their growth. And so with this talk, I want to give a bit of an idea of what we see as the three, actually I took that already away, 3 building blocks of an experimentation program. But before we go in, I quickly want to tell a story. Unfortunately, I can't reveal who that was specifically, but it was the CMO of one of our clients. And I was just writing him a message a while back saying that I really appreciate working with him and his team, and that it's always a pleasure. And he replied with a bit of a story, and it was basically, I translated this from German because we're a German company and the conversation initially took place in German, but he basically described how things turned over the duration of us working together and building the experimentation program in the company. And he described it as being initially a bit annoying because it was extra work to how they were initially rolling out features, rolling out changes to their websites and to their apps. But over time, that actually that changed, and the way they saw experimentation, the way they saw A/B testing, that changed. And so I'm really happy to actually share this because this was also a fun moment for us, because it was again showing that experimentation, once deployed in a company and once it's not only just us working on running tests and rolling them out, can really have an impact. But now this as a quick intro, as a quick start. But if we go into the next slide here, I quickly want to show you what we want to talk through today. The first one is looking at people running experiments throughout a company. Then the actual building blocks, and I can share it's basically 3 building blocks that we see: 1, buying, process, and visibility. Then we will talk a bit about experimentation maturity and what it means for you and what you can take away from it for the next day and for hopefully the growth of experimentation within your company. And so quickly, I don't want to do too much about it, but if you like this talk, if it's at all interesting, check out my LinkedIn. I have some resources there about experimentation, my bits and bobs, what I think about how to scale experimentation in your company. And yeah, also, of course, if you want to work with us, this is the place to go and check out. So quickly, I mentioned like people running experiments in your company, and I like this graphic here quite a bit, where on the bottom end in this circle we have basically singular. So experiments are run maybe by 1 or 2 people, but often heavily monitored by management or leadership, where every experiment has to first go through a rigid approval process. Not really what you would think about an experimentation program or an experimentation culture within the company that encourages to try things out, right? Then there is the next bubble, right? So, and I described it as some, because there might be some people working on experimentation, working on rolling out experiments, testing features. What I see oftentimes is this oftentimes limited to marketing. So people run marketing experiments, not necessarily only in A/B testing, but also in running ad tests, right? Like testing out different ad sets or whatever, or creatives in this process. This is often where agencies start to come in, right? It's a company realizes, so you might realize, hey, we need to use experimentation. You might have heard about A/B testing, and you want to scale it to the next level. This is usually where agencies come in, or where a small team is somewhat siloed working on experiment. And then there is, I just thought like this infinity sign would describe it in the best possible way, but where literally everyone in the company is allowed to run experiments, or at least to commission them, contribute in this process of experimentation that you want to grow, right? So this is our idea. But yeah, basically our idea of where everybody can run experiments, how eventually companies grow. And you can see this in the examples of Microsoft, Booking, Amazon, all these big companies where it's not really 1 or 2 people running experiments, right? You can't even imagine like one person doing all of that for one of the aforementioned companies, but it's really in all the departments, people are running experiments, right? I want you to, before we continue, quickly assess where you are or where your company is in these buckets, and maybe later in the questions you can share, but also just keep it in mind for a later portion of this webinar. I promised some building blocks, right? And before, I mean, I think I already mentioned them, but before I go into and revealing them here in this slide, I quickly wanna say something about how I see an experimentation program growing, right? So at first, an experimentation program won't grow if you don't have anybody enabling it. And it won't work if you don't have anybody driving it. And it won't scale if you don't have anybody growing it. So there's the 3 building blocks that we see is literally like buy-in, getting leadership buy-in, then process, having a fundamental process, and this is like the core of this webinar as well, is like knowing each and every step in the experimentation program and having somebody look over that. And then visibility, because without visibility, there is no way to grow it, because nobody will know that you run experiments. But we'll go into the individual building blocks throughout this webinar, and let's start with buy-in as the first one. So buy-in is basically getting leadership, or people who give the money or who make the decisions, especially in companies that are less mature in the beginning, to buy into the idea of experimentation. They need to understand that experimentation, running things, and not just like creating a rigid roadmap of features or changes to the website, is what actually can drive growth. And they also need to understand what this does in regards to risk management and all these kind of things. So if I was to take anything away, even without the process, like get leadership to buy in to the idea of experimentation, right? Sell them the idea, sell them what experimentation, running tests, but even the mindset behind it, what this can have, what kind of impact this can have to your company and to your growth, and to making data-driven decisions, right? But this is step 1 in getting buy-in, and making buy-in from leadership, from management, an important part of experimentation, because without them you won't have any chance, right? So the second one that I really like to look at is setting clear goals, right? Because if you don't have any goal, it's first very hard to sell the idea of experimentation, because nobody knows in which direction you're going, what do you want to achieve, and what kind of results this can lead to. And of course, in an experimentation program, if you're already running tests, you know the best. It's very hard to know what you're going to get out of it, because people all the time like to say, okay, we want a 30% increase in revenue, or sometimes even more extra, like higher amounts. But is this really what counts? And isn't it like also part about risk management, right? Making the right decisions for your company. What I always suggest and what we do with clients if they don't have it already, but actually most companies do have it, especially in management tiers where decisions are currently being made, there is a goal tree map or some kind of representation of how you achieve where you want to go, right? So this is what I recommend, is actually looking at a goal tree map and aligning the goals you already have as a company. And maybe also work with like your sprints, the quarters, or how OKRs, however your company works right now. Don't change it all, but work with these metrics, with these goals to align your experimentation efforts in these areas. So this is the very important step, and I would not suggest just skipping it and getting directly into running experiments, because you need buy-in, and if people on all levels don't know what's at stake, then there is no point. But the third one is also budget, right? And I also added in agencies, because especially if you're not there yet, you need some kind of budget. But budget also extends to people. Like if you want to grow experimentation across the company, there might be new roles you need to hire for. And while I could make an entire presentation solely about how to budget for experimentation and the kind of teams you need, or the kind of teams that can really help, evolve your experimentation program throughout time, I think it just comes down to thinking about like the people you need, you already have, and creating a core team, but also training. You don't want people to just have the same information, the same knowledge that they have right now, but you want them to actually grow over time, right? And generally something that already happens in most companies, but make sure to also budget for these things specific to experimentation and to these efforts. And also, of course, I mean, we're in a VWO webinar, but generally, like, think about what tools do you need? What research tools, what A/B testing tools do you need? Or maybe does your company require a completely custom experimentation solution? Think about these things and get the budget for it. It's super important, because without the budget, without the means, you can try as hard as you want, but you just won't get anywhere. Because in the end, money might be missing, right? And then one thing, and we did a lot of mistakes in the beginning here, especially as an agency, but what we figured out is that reporting is very, very, very crucial. Not just because it gives us an idea where we are, how the program is evolving, or like how individual tests perform, but it's very important also to validate the buy-in that we got initially, and to keep a constant loop with people that are still providing us and enabling us to do this. And this is especially important in the beginning, because oftentimes experimentation programs start out as a pilot phase, right? People or companies start, let's try this for 3 months, 6 months, a year. But over this time, constantly reminding of the progress you're making, but also sharing the learnings, right? Sharing what stuff went wrong. And it's very important to build this kind of mindset that way, that people understand it's not just about the revenue added. It's very important, or whatever the metric is you're optimizing for, but that people actually know what's happening. This is super important. Now later, when we talk about visibility, the third building block that I'm talking about today, I'll talk about meeting cadence and reporting cadence a bit more. All right, this is the first building block, I think, done. And before we go into the second one, funny enough, whoever at VWO who created the post and to promote today's webinar had this this quote in there from Edward Stemming, and I'll quickly read it to you. If you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you just literally don't know what you're doing. And this couldn't be more true in experimentation than it is in so many other fields. And the reason is because if you don't really have a process, if you just catch a test idea from here and implement an experiment here and make a decision there, then things are just going their own weird ways. But where the real power of experimentation lies, and of having an experimentation program, is having a process that you can optimize. And we'll later also see why this is so important. But let's quickly dive into the process, because this is eventually what's gonna drive experimentation in your company. And I probably won't go into all and every single step, because this would just also take way more time than we have today in this scope and as part of this presentation. But one thing, if we start looking at how we as an agency start experimentation with clients, we usually have a couple steps, a couple phases, and then I'll go into the next step. I'll show you also how that could look like. But we first need to define success, and you see the similarities to what this means in regard to getting buy-in. Obviously, for an agency like us, we most of the time already have buy-in from leadership, because they basically created a contract with us, right? But defining success is so important, because we need to understand also, not just for reporting's sake, but really need to understand what we should optimize for, and where we can optimize. And so this is usually phase one. Phase two is getting an understanding of your customers, understanding bottlenecks, and analyzing the website or apps or whatever the asset is that we are optimizing as part of the scope of working with clients. But then also really doing deep research. And this is a part you'll see later again, but that's oftentimes skipped. It's just doing research. It's so easy to jump to the next best test ideas, but research is the foundation of creating good test ideas and coming up with with ideas and a plan and a strategy of executing your ideas, of course, right? So, and then hypotheses. I see it so often in experimentation programs, or amateur, I would say, even experimentation programs, where hypotheses are oftentimes very, very far at the back. Like after implementation, people think, or after evaluation of experiment results, where people think about, what did we actually do? They might come up with an idea and just implement it or test it, but never think about what the actual meta structure of this experiment, this A/B test, might be. So creating sound hypotheses, and there's, I think in my recent newsletter, I referred to a couple articles about this, and I'm happy to share this on LinkedIn again tomorrow or something. But there's very good material on how to create proper hypotheses based on the research you're already doing, hopefully that you're doing. So very, very important step. And then planning and running your tests, right? There is several frameworks that are also shared by other agencies or people in the space that you can use to really plan and make a plan of how to run experiments over time. So it's not just the one-time efforts of let's create like 10 experiments and then run them over the next half a year, but actually creating a plan and strategy behind the kind of tests you want to run to learn more about your users, but eventually also to improve the product or the website you have. So and there is obviously also prioritization that goes into that, and already as part of the hypothesis step. But then even running tests, there's so many things that play into it. You need to design it, you need to develop it, you need to create a statistical design for the test, right? Something that's also oftentimes overlooked, because people jump to developing it too fast, or jump to hitting the run for however many weeks in their testing tool. But this is all steps that I very much encourage you to look at how you're currently doing, what you're currently doing, and just writing down the process, like very meticulously. And there's things like Q&A. How does Q&A work? How is it executed on a technical level? And all these kind of things, all the way to the point where you're like hitting that button and start the experiment. But then also the next step, right? Create a system for how you deal with the situation with monitoring when experiments are running, because you need to understand based on metrics, is an experiment actually like hurting you right now? And there was a great talk by Lucas Bemer that you can find online about how you can detect when errors happen, right? And probably not applicable to all the companies that run experiments, but it's super important to have a plan for every step of the way. So from first insight to all the way when you're ending an experiment. So I can just highly encourage you to just write it down. It's a bit of a tiresome process, but writing down the process and also figure out ways to optimize that. And this is, I think I skipped this one, but so the full process that we have is usually accompanied by a more enclosed but testing process that is actually then iterative. So just wanted to mention that, of course. We don't do defining success in every cycle. All right, a white page, but usually how we work with clients is in retainers. Doesn't really matter for the scope of this presentation, but I just put these slides in because this is something we use whenever we present to a client how we'll be working with them together. And I just want to give you a quick glimpse at how this usually works. And for some companies in some situations, and I'm happy to go into how this could actually look like, but this can be a blueprint of how to kick off experimentation or the first couple spins of the so-called experimentation flywheel. And you see the similarities again to what I was just presenting to you. We start with defining success, then we do a deep dive. That's at least what I called it here, where we do research and all these kind of things to find out where we are and where we want to be, and find out more about users, their behavior, and also do analysis of the website, of course. But then we work in sprints, right? This is also operationally something that you want to think about. How do you work in these circles and in these cycles? Sorry. And yeah, this is something I can highly encourage you. It doesn't have to be a fancy presentation like this, or it can simply be a document where you define the process, where you define how operationally you will run this process, how you will drive it, and then do yourself a favor and just write it down, share it with people, and make it actually something that you regularly assess also. And also here, actually, I have a bit of a deep dive, let's just call it like that, into what these individual work packages oftentimes look like. We adjust that for clients, but you see, we cover operations, we cover how and what kind of sprints we work, we cover what is usually included as part of the continuous research, and also as part of reporting. And this is something that's super important, and not that we do all these things, but that we have it written down somewhere. And not just because we're an agency and we kind of need to get budget for stuff, but because also it helps us actually operate with this process. So that's enough about us and how we do it, but let's go a bit into what the foundations also of a process are. And I mentioned it before, it's like research. This is one of the things that I skipped so many times, but it can provide so much clarity and so much information that you oftentimes just miss. And in companies that are very like already work in a user-centric way, this is maybe something that's not obvious, that's more obvious than in others, but put your user first, talk with people, right? Do qualitative analysis, like look through customer voice analysis and make this part of the process at every step of the way, and or at least at regular intervals. But also use data. So many companies have so much data that goes unused. It's just collected over time, but never really used. But use this for research. You can find anomalies in behavior or in how people just use, in the customer journey, how people use the website, and use it to gather insights. But what do we do with all these insights, then later test ideas and experiments? Well, what oftentimes happens is people just write it down in Asana tasks, or for more product companies in Jira maybe. But what we really want is to have a really good documentation of what happened. Again, what happened every step of the way. So we're mostly working with Airtable here. a recommendation that I got, maybe you're listening, but from Ruben a couple of years back. And this has been really, really helpful. For us as an agency right now, we're working on building a tool, though, that also helps us better document and also scale with this documentation process and learn more across clients also. But make sure you're creating a structure for documentation of your process, so it doesn't all go to waste. And then the third, like, building block as part of a process is like, make sure you really understand how to use hypotheses and how to actually create them so they mean something. So they're not just a thing that you do and then it lands somewhere or is in a presentation or your slide deck, but make your hypotheses the backbone of your strategy. So these actually represent what you're doing, and that they will eventually help you also learn more from your experiments when you're analyzing them at the end. And then the fourth one, and oftentimes also very, very much missed, is like automation. In the beginning, when we started, especially with Airtable, we didn't have much automation in place. But what we realized over time is that there is so many recurring tasks that really nobody liked. It's like oftentimes creating presentations. They kind of look the same all over, like every single time, not in terms of content, but in terms of structure. But then also stuff like gathering test ideas and notifying people of when stuff is happening, creating tasks in your task layer and all these kind of things. All this stuff can be automated. And so I'll actually go and continue here and with a bigger picture of that. Tool landscape can range from various things. So we work here with Airtable a lot, but we're also on building our Conversion Lab studio. But then we use tools like Slack, Asana, Jira on client side a lot of the times. But we want to connect all these. We want to connect all these tools so they make sense for us. And and so we don't have to do all of the heavy lifting and heavy work. So what I recommend is like looking at what kind of connections you have in terms of API, or use leveraged Zapier. It's like it doesn't cost a lot, but can really help you automate processes and stuff. So but this requires, of course, you to know what your process looks like, and identifying also at every step of the way where you can automate and what steps are repetitive, right? So let's go into visibility, because we talked a lot about process, and how to drive the process, but I also want to focus on and give a bit of an idea on visibility, because without people knowing what you're doing, like if you're even as an agency, like if nobody knows in the company what we're doing, how would we even encourage them to participate, to partake in this process, bring in their own ideas from maybe from other parts of the operations and all these kind of things. So visibility is very, very important. And I created, I think, this slide for a presentation for Conversion Hotel a couple months back, I think in November, but just to share a bit how visibility through meetings and touch points over time can really help people to be more engaged in this process. And something I think I referred to it also earlier is like create a meeting and reporting cadence. So just make sure you have certain meetings in the calendar that actually where you talk with stakeholders, with leadership, but also then think about all the other people who are or could be involved in the experimentation process. And what I, for example, really like to do, I mean, we're maybe a bit of a special case because we're an agency, but I like to bring in new people into meetings regularly, because if they have ideas that can help us or help the company drive the experimentation process, or just come up with new ideas for experiments, then I really want that. I want people to have good ideas, or I want people to be able to put their ideas into the process. But this would never happen if there wasn't this interface. So interfaces could be, for example, meetings where people share their ideas, but an interface could also be, and we usually have a Slack channel with clients, or sometimes multiple ones, but where we share and actually pin a message where we tell people, hey, if you have an idea, just go into this form, quickly jot down your idea with a couple of extra pieces of information, and you'll be notified when this one actually makes it into an experiment. And this is one way of tying people back into the process and making them part of it. So, and we also here we have like scorecards and presentations that in our case are fully automated. So when with reports coming in from experiments, once they're ready, once they're done, we have an automation that creates experimentation like these scorecards for us, and also helps us understand and analyze experiments. So visibility can take a lot of shapes throughout the company, or depending on the company you're in. But what I really encourage you to is like make more people part of it and be a bit of an evangelist in your organization and share with people. And that could be like a newsletter, this could be a Slack channel, and there could be just meetings where you sometimes come up with ideas together and make this a bit more of a game, and place bets on stuff that could work or not. But visibility will enable you to actually grow experimentation in the company. Right. So if we come back to this quote in a way of this small conversation, you can see how a lot of these things, a lot of the building blocks, can actually help you go from, oh, this is a bit of an annoyance, to actually having the team engaged. And as this was coming from the CMO of that company, I was very happy to see that, because he also has a good idea of what's happening in various departments. So yeah, I was very happy to see that. But now when we look at where you are as a company and with your current experimentation program, we can also talk about experimentation maturity. And earlier, I think I'll go to this one first. Earlier, we talked about how many people are running experiments throughout the company, or commission experiments. And if I was to break this down more into a ladder that people, or into steps where people can walk up to, or a company can evolve over time, there's this framework called experimentation maturity, where you can see that there is various levels, starting from initial, right, where experiments are run more on an ad hoc level. And then second, where in definition it's called, I think, where there's already a good process in place. And there's integration, where the experimentation process is also integrated across the tool landscape, for example, and more into the process as in general operations. And for management and measurement, where experimentation is actually already spread across the organization. And then the ultimate level, basically, optimization, where it's not just about optimizing individual assets, but optimizing the process itself. And if you think about it, where you want to be as a company, I think you want to be more on the upper end of this ladder, of these steps, of the staircase, whatever you want to call it. And this is why it's so important to take these building blocks, start out on the bottom, get buy-in, create a process, and you're already probably somewhere here, right? Even if it's with an agency, right? This is super legit to work with an agency in the beginning. What's important though is to make sure that the work done by the agency is not siloed across the company or in the company, but that actually you can, and that the agency encourages you to run more experiments even outside of their scope. And then step by step, actually getting to the point where experimentation or experiments are run all across the company, and where people have actually an interest in running experiments. And of course, this is done by visibility. And there we go. Experimentation maturity is something that will take a lot of time. I wish it was a 3-month project that you could do in a company, but there's so many factors that contribute to that. Culture, resources. Again, we talked initially about budget, methodology, which is basically the process and all the bits and bobs that come with creating a sound process. Infrastructure, making sure you do have the tools. you do have everything that's needed. Even infrastructure can be like meetings and having structure for that. And then integration as basically having leadership also make their decisions based on experiments. And now that we talk about leadership and experiments, it's a bit weird because previously we were talking about purely A/B tests. But creating this culture of decision making that's based on data, this is where experimentation really shines, because people start understanding that their intuition might not always be right, and people will see that running experiments, again, doesn't have to be an A/B test, but sometimes can just be a bet that you place on something, and then you measure it, you measure the outcome, and then you see where you are and where this compares to your initial hypothesis. So all these factors play into experimentation maturity, and that combined with the building blocks, and here's the takeaways again, it's super simple, not in execution, but in the way it's constructed. Get buy-in, create and define a process, stick to the process, even if an experiment doesn't work, stick to it, and then create visibility over time. This is not the easiest thing, but if you take a couple of the things I was suggesting and maybe come up with more ideas on how to create visibility in your specific case, then this can really help grow experimentation in your company and go towards a more data-driven decision-making process. And eventually, just look at the examples of the big ones, like Amazon, right? Like Booking.com and others. They're running experiments all the time, thousands of them. Probably not something that you can achieve like with just a couple of things I shared in this presentation, but the principle is the one that counts. So I encourage you, get this right, and you're already set off to a good start with experimentation in your company. And yeah, that's me saying thanks. Appreciated so many people showed up, and I'm open